The Norwegian Method.
I'm Olav Alexander Bu, peak human performance developer, coach to Christian Blumenfeld and Gustav Eden.
I'm Dr. David Lipman, a health and human performance specialist, and welcome to the Norwegian Method podcast.
The Norwegian Method.
Welcome back to the Norwegian Method podcast, and joining me today is Olav. Welcome, Olav.
Thanks, David.
And today we're going to be talking about a paper that was released recently, one that you obviously contributed to, and is about Christian. So listeners probably have heard about this or have seen this. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. It was one looking at the maximal sustainable energy expenditure in an athlete. And this made some rounds. I saw it on social media. People, lots of comments, lots of thoughts. So when I was talking to you a little while ago, we decided, listen, let's do a podcast about it. Let's explain some stuff, give people a preview of what's coming as well, because there's some more stuff coming. And let's sort of talk all about the details here. I guess let's start at the beginning. Why did you decide to publish this? Because we've actually seen some similar stuff published recently from other people. Magnus Ditlev and his team published something. It's obviously been some stuff on the women's tour from Jaco Lula. So I'm interested in why you decided to publish this, because I don't necessarily think they looked at you and said, oh, they're doing it, so we'll do it. But I do think there's a trend towards this, which I think is really, really helpful and important for science. So what was the impetus for you guys to publish?
I think one of the biggest drivers behind this for me is that it is about finding peak human performance, like where are the ultimate limits of it. And probably we won't find it either. It will take some more time to really get there. But we got very much further in the process than what we thought was possible. One of the things that I think, or I hope, and I also experience, is that a lot more people I'm in contact with have become much more open about the processes, their thinking, their ideas. What are they learning from the process? And we've been very open about this from early on. I have had a very clear philosophy that if I basically try to protect what I do and keep it secret, there are two things with that. One is that you never get back more than what you share. So call it sharing is caring, as people say. But the other part of it is also that I think when you share information about what you do and being open about it, also it puts us out of the comfort zone, and it keeps me pushing all the time to find new competitive advantages. I see too many times people find something and they think that that's brilliant and so on. Yeah, that's fine. But people always try to catch up. And the most dangerous thing that happens is that you get stuck with what you do and you don't keep advancing. And sharing is a really good way of both caring and helping lifting up the whole environment or industry. But on the other side, also, it's a really good way of always pushing yourself out of the comfort zone and start looking for new things as well. It doesn't give you the room to get comfortable with what you are doing. Then I think, why now? I think for the project became much longer than what it was originally intended to be. First, the idea was to start publishing after Tokyo, but then we decided to go into the long course project and do that as well. So then we also saw that, there are things that we still want to figure out. So we really didn't have the time for it, and also there were things there that we wanted to understand better before we really started to start talking too much about it. Then after Kona 2022, this is the time when we really started thinking, now we are getting closer to where we will start publishing. So we actually started, I think, on the article in 2023. It was basically, that's when we started to gather together all the data that we had collected throughout the project, because we did several rounds with Doubly labeled water, and it was not only on Christian, it was also on Gustav as well, and we also done it on others, and we done it so over several periods. So the thing is that we started actually the work in 2023, but you can imagine here there's so much data. It's not only the Doubly label water data, it's so much other data as well that are supporting on this, and where we're bringing together correlations between them. That it took some time before it came, and now finally we were able to bring it together. We were able to have it out for review, get back some small comments and some small adjustments that we needed to do on it, and then it got it published, and that was really nice.
Yeah, and I think it's a real challenge because if you just, I mean, one thing you could do is just publish this on like a blog or something similar, right? You could just put out a white paper or whatever, put in all the athletes you want, put in all the data you want, you'd have no limits. And the challenge with that, or the downside of that, is people then go, well, it wasn't peer reviewed. We don't know about the quality of this, right? But now you put it in a scientific journal. Now they say, well, you've got a word limit. Oh, you've got a figure limit. Oh, you can't do this. Or, oh, that, that data isn't, you didn't control this. Or you put in 3 athletes, but they did different times. This isn't valid, right? So you end up running this ecologically valid versus scientifically valid. You walk this tightrope between them. And I think people can misunderstand that on both sides of either the scientific community or the sort of less scientifically well, people outside the scientific community who are scientifically minded, perhaps, is the way to think about that. So there's always trade-offs there, unfortunately. So I just wanted to bring that up so that listeners might understand that that might be the reason. But is that the reason why you didn't include people like Gustav and others in this sort of data, or is there other stuff that was at play there?
No, it was less complicated than that. And I think you bring up a very valid point. It was important for us exactly to get this peer review. And we had some reviewers that, some really good reviewers on the paper, on top of having already also quite significant researchers as a part of the group working on the article as well. So and that is exactly because sometimes you might have forgotten something and other things, and when you just publish on a blog or anything like this, then you can do there can be a lot of things with the data or something that you skip or that you leave out for certain reasons. But the ability to do that and the chances you end up doing that, whether it's probably most cases non-deliberately, but you just forget because there's a lot of other things as well. That is something that gets a sanity check when you decide to publish. So that's that I would say that is important, and that's also what's going to happen with the let's say with the article series that we also are publishing. All of it will be published, so basically peer reviewed, and the whole process of bringing it out. But where this story from where the maximum sustainable energy expenditure, that is what I believe is the ceiling for basically how good you can really be, and then basically you bring it all the way, the story, then ultimately to the why and how this ties back into pure velocity from A to B.
Yeah, and for those who are unfamiliar with what you're talking about, the very first episode we released on this podcast feed, The Fundamentals of the Norwegian Method, will explain that well. And I think based on what you've just said and that episode, people can intuit what is coming from a scientific article standpoint, given the way you think. Was the data reflected? Sorry, now I'm enamored by the fact you did this on more than one person. Was it similar? Were you seeing similar in other athletes to KB, or is he an outlier?
No, that's the interesting thing. We saw this in the other athletes also in the group as well. So this, because if it was an outlier, then I would say that having that, why are we able to reproduce in other athletes? And there is something that we need to dig deeper into. But the really interesting part here was exactly that this was something that we saw that was we are able to get the same numbers in other athletes as well.
It's interesting you mentioned that because I shared the article abstract with a few people, not necessarily in prep for this podcast, but some of those conversations have informed some of my questions. And a lot of them said, I've actually seen very similar to this in elite athletes before. So I think many people who haven't dealt with elite athletes thought this was a huge outlier and it must be wrong. And I think those who dealt with elite athletes went, yeah, that's about what I've seen as well. I'm happy someone's published on this.
What is very important to distinguish between is that this have been seen in elite athletes before, but only for a very, very limited period. this the whole point here, and the reason why we bring in the training data as well, is that you can see the correlation between basically the doubly labeled water, the training volume, or let's say the kilojoule work that is being done there, and then the gap in between the period there, where obviously you have the same thing, and then also and then you get the training history all the way back from, I think we included all the way back from, was it 2021, 2020, 2021, and you basically see this,
2021.
so you,
no, sorry, January 2020.
Yeah, and then you see this the whole period through, let's say, all these years with it there. So, for example, let's say call it the novelty here, or the, let's say, the craziness here, is that this have been observed in Tour de France. It's been or let's say or big tours where they do multi-stage riding and so on. But what happens, and what you'll see if you go into the papers there, is that it looks like this. So they get numbers that are close to, for example, Christian in this case here, but it still is below, and it's basically taking from, for example, the Giro or Tour de France. But after 2 weeks, suddenly something is happening, and which is indicating that this is potentially not sustainable, and probably also why the Tour de France couldn't have been 4 weeks. It's 3 weeks is probably at the limit of it, while Christian demonstrates that, well, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, it's the same. And that also comes to that we have a very different philosophy when it comes to nutrition and how we see that as a limitation also to the amount of work you can do, and also some other things that are maybe creating some short circuits in how we think that we have to develop performance in an athlete. But again, coming back to it, yes, this has been observed in like 4.5, 4.7, for example, times the BMR or RMR, depending on what they have been using, have been observed, but only for a limited time. And that is not then the maximum sustainable energy expenditure, because the whole point with maximum sustainable energy expenditure is that it is something that you, not only for the block you are investigating with for example, with doubly labeled water or full room calorimetry or whatever you do, it is something that you should be able to do or let's say month by month and year by year. That is really your maximum sustainable energy expenditure. Because if you go to 1 day, for example, just to take the polar opposite, if you go to 1 day energy expenditure, and then you'll see that you can go to 5, you can go 6, 7, maybe 8 times the energy expenditure. Like if you take an ultra runner that are running 24 hours, you will see some crazy numbers. But the whole point is it is not sustainable. And the thing is that the more crazy you go 1 day, the more you actually have to pay back the following days as well. The less you take out 1 day, the more you can spread it over multiple days. And at some point, you are finding that balance where you have the maximum sustainable energy expenditure, something that you can do day by day, week by week, month by month, and so on. And that's the whole point there, by also then sharing the training volume in kilojoules for Christian as well, because we know that for 1 kilojoule of work, if you have a biochemical efficiency of 20%, for example, then we know how much calories you're consuming there. And here, doubly labeled water, not perfect, but is considered as a gold standard for non-intrusive measurements, where you can exactly, you're looking more at the CO2 side of it, but where you basically then can say, okay, fine, this is how much calories consuming, and this is how much work he is doing as well. And then you get a good number for it. But then you can't say that after that period, is this really representative for the longer period? Is it different in different training blocks and this kind of thing? And why it was important then to us to show also then all the training that, let's say, the volume of work in kilojoules, not in hours, because hours doesn't tell you anything. You need the kilojoules. And then you can see that in between the period there, and then you get another block of double labeled water again to basically show that it's there. And you also see there, I think, if I'm not mistaken, these are not the blocks where they put out the highest kilojoules either. It's average. These are average blocks even, which again, where you can then anticipate that obviously then also the energy expenditure is higher for other blocks there than it actually is for these 2 measured blocks there. But again, maximum sustainable energy expenditure is really not something you do for 2 weeks when you're using double labeled water. It is something, when we talk about it, it is something that has actually is sustainable energy expenditure over a long period, years, basically, that tells you something about the budget that you have available when you are planning and training, and they're saying how many high intensity, medium intensity, low intensity sessions you're going to have and how long and short they are going to be.
Yeah, and so just for listeners who may be less scientifically inclined or haven't read the paper yet, we will put a link to the abstract in the show notes. But basically, the prevailing theory before your public paper was that the basal metabolic rate, which is the amount of energy, or the resting metabolic rate, the amount of energy required for you to live and do nothing, lie dead still, 2.5 times this was considered the maximal sustainable energy expenditure, the most you could burn sustainably ongoing.
And I want to add to that, that has been researched so many times before, and it's been established as a fact, not only one time in a paper, but again and again and again and again over the last decades. And the reason for why this has been researched, not only in humans, but also in mammals, is actually because we see it as a limitation to reproduction and performance, actually. And that's why we want to say that when we had the training data, that this cannot be true, because we measure so much calorimetry with the VO2 master when we are before breakfast, after breakfast, before training, during training, after trainings, and these kind of things, where we knew that this is much higher than it is, and it's not only for a period, it's for the long period. And that's why we thought we need to get this information out to maybe start shifting the focus a little bit away from what we think maybe are holding people back from advancing.
Yeah, and so that's the thought, that that's the maximal sustainable. As you alluded to, things like Tour de France, etc., have been measured quite a lot higher. I think you said something around the 4 or 5 times, perhaps.
4.5, 4.7 is the highest, but that have very often also been outliers as well. On a group basis, it has also normally been lower. But again, we have to distinguish between that is energy expenditure measured during Tour de France. It's not maximum sustainable, because we have to distinguish between maximal energy expenditure, which is then has no time constant to it. So if you look at maximal energy expenditure, it would basically, the best thing would be just to look at do a sprint, and you say, okay, maximal energy expenditure for a sprint. Yeah, obviously that's going to be sky high because you do a lot of work during a very short period. But everybody understands you can't go out and push 1,000 watts every second for the next 2 hours. So there's a limit to the energy expenditure that you're going to do, or let's say the work. Obviously, no velocity without power, no power without calories. So again, you can't go out and do those high sprints or anything like this continuously, because there is a cap to the energy expenditure, or how much energy you are able to supply. Meaning also that then you understand that surely that's a huge energy expenditure if you just look at the work that is done there for that very, very short time. But that also means that when we talk about what's important not to confuse is that even though people use double labeled water, it doesn't mean that then you have quantified the maximum sustainable energy expenditure. You're quantifying energy expenditure, and in Tour de France, you're obviously looking at something that is close to maximal energy expenditure for 14 to 21 days. That's what you're really looking for. And where we see that the energy expenditure the first 14 days are actually significantly higher, and then the last week the body goes into some kind of preservation state or something like that, protecting itself. We don't know, but where energy expenditure actually goes down quite significantly the last week there. While in this case, the point for us was to prove by doing several periods of double labeled water and then showing the training data to say this is not energy expenditure for a very unique block of training or something like that, but actually continuously over a long time, and which you then can say this is sustainable, because that has also been actually discussed in research literature, that many of these papers, they say, yeah, well, we can see that some studies are showing this much energy expenditure and these kind of things, but we don't think it is sustainable on a 3-month or 6-month or 12-month basis, because the studies doesn't actually include that into there. Well, this is a study that looks on it on a multi-year aspect and correlating and double label water with it to act as a reference on what really is possible for athletes. And we'll come back to why this is important. We have already talked about it before, about budgeting. An athlete that has 2 hours of 2 hours of training available per week, for example, or 4 hours for that sake available per week, and let's say that he on average is able to burn or expend 2,000 calories, for example, on those sessions. We can all say that, well, 2,000 kilojoules on a session, that's then it's not a massive ride, especially not for elites. But for an amateur, it's a okay ride. It would be the equivalent of riding 276 watts for 2 hours. That gives you 2,000 kilojoules. And then on top of that, you need more calories because you're not 25% efficient. You are less efficient. So probably that will equate to probably 2,400 kilocalories expended, which then is actually very close to the sustainable energy expenditure. But obviously for an athlete that are training now, that can train like Christian and Gustav 30 hours a week, for example, and you are able to feed it, the more you're able to feed this, it means that you cannot only do the easy, slow rides, and they have to be capped in size, but you can also put in, for example, that if me and you were training and you said, oh, I need to become better, I identified I need a VO2 max session, for example, maybe I need a threshold session, I want to have a long ride as well, because that's what I'm going to do in an Ironman. If I can then do 2 VO2 max sessions a week, 2 threshold sessions a week, and a couple of more rides, we both understand that to bring it down to the simplest level in a workout, having one interval, I think we all agree that that's a very, very little stimulus. And that's the reason for why we have multiple intervals in a workout, because there's a larger stimulus than a single one. But we very often fail with this because we don't see longer than a single workout, and we think it's about a single workout. It's not. It's about the consistency over time, and consistency over time is then also directly reflected also in the volume, and volume meaning basically not hours, but a Y and an X, meaning there is an intensity to it or energy to it and duration to it. Again, so you get kilojoules or kilocalories. So more kilocalories, more kilojoules you can expend on training, meaning that you can get more stimulus. So talking about one interval versus multiple intervals, we all agree that multiple intervals is more stimulus than a single interval. But this is also, if you remove yourself also for construct of days and nights and weeks, and you just think of it as a continuous time series, and you just add the intervals in there, and then you get a set break, and then you get intervals in between there, and then you get, call it a set break, where you do only rest in between there, you still expend calories, and then you do another one. We all understand that the more you can pack in per time, the more likely it's going to drive also performance. But also what we do know, the closer you get to the maximum sustainable energy expenditure for you, it means also that the requirement for precision becomes also even more important. And the problem is we don't have a good gauge to understand whether we are really in a balance. Even your scale, there are flaws to that, not because the scale doesn't show the real weight of you, but simply because the body is able to compensate in a lot of different ways by, for example, storing more water. When, for example, when you're starting to shed weight, for example, you store more water, so it looks like you are the same weight, but actually what's happening is that you are maybe storing more water, or the other things that are happening here. There are, let's say, inflating your weight above what it really is. But if you have gone in and you looked at your muscle mass, or you looked at your fat mass and these kind of things, suddenly you start to see that, oh, there's something that is happening here that we need to be cautious about. And that's also why with Christian and Gustav, for example, we have done DEXAs normally 3 to 4 times a year to make sure that everything stays in balance there. Everything from bone density to also basically muscle mass, fat mass, and other things as well. And even to the point where because we've been pushing the limit, it's been important for me that they've had a little bit extra fat on their body than rather on the other side, because that can very quickly lead to non-consistent, or let's say lacking consistency, meaning also that volume goes down. And if volume goes down, also obviously your maximum sustainable energy expenditure is also capped as well for it. So.
Yeah, we're going to come back to body because that stuff was fascinating as part of the paper. It was what alerted to some people. I just wanted to touch a bit more there just to color in some more for people. We talked about 2.5 being the historical limit. You guys measured 3.6 to 3.8 times BMR was sustainable for you in those periods. And also, you mentioned that the periods were reflective. I think in the paper it was mentioned that those weeks that you used the doubly labeled water accounted for something like the equivalent of 50 something percent, which is to say that week was repeated roughly 50% of the time across 3 years or something similar to that. So that is really reflective then. It's basically half of the weeks of the 3 year period that was similar to that. So I just wanted to color that in for people again who either haven't got access to the full paper or haven't read the full paper.
Also important for me to say, I also know now that that's a very important thing that you actually mentioned there. And that is that the numbers that we are also talking about now are going through a little bit of a shift as well. Because when I say 4.7 actually times for Tour de France, that was based on the old way of calculating it. And in that scale, actually, Christian and Gustav was sitting in at 5 to 5.2 times, or even higher, even 5.4, I think, sustainably. So this is recalculated now for the, let's say, for where, let's say, the change that has been in doubly labeled water is that we are now distinguishing between more elite athletes and let's say amateur athletes, because there are other things also happening as a function, or let's say there are weaknesses to doubly labeled water that you need to account for, and the new system is trying to reflect better than the old system did with this. Yeah.
And this is the plateau versus intercept method, I assume. Is that what you're talking about there? Because I'm not as familiar with doubly labeled water. I'm familiar with how it works, but not the calculations from it. So that makes sense. And we won't, there's no need to go into that because I think that's probably a level of depth beyond where most people need to. One thing that you mentioned in the paper that I want to touch on quickly is altitude. Obviously, we've talked about altitude quite a bit previously. I guess in this context, there's an assumption that probably BMR is going to be higher and general, I guess, general energy expenditure will be higher. What's your gut around the impact that altitude had on these numbers?
So one of the things that we know, because we are using also indirect telemetry on top of doubly labeled water. Actually, we're using two systems. We're actually using, call it a quasi direct telemetry system as well. Basically, where we're measuring the thermal power of the athletes as well. But also then you have indirect telemetry as two. And that is the one thing that we at least there are many ways to do this, but we have a long experience with altitude training, and obviously tracking also hemoglobin mass and other things, because when you go to altitude there should be a purpose of it, because you're changing environment. So the purpose can be just purely acclimatizing for a race that's going to happen at altitude, or you could say no, we are using it to try to enhance the performance when you come back to sea level again. And there over several decades it has, my mentor have obviously developed quite a bit of knowledge on it, but also we've taken it quite a few steps further by also starting to do much more measurements of not only hemoglobin mass but also the kinetics and other things that are involved with it. And one thing that we do see is that the way we control the system is that normally what happens there is that we see the resting metabolic rate is what really goes up during altitude. So it can go up by, let's say, 20-25% when you are at altitude. But depending also what kind of altitude you are at. If you are at high altitude, it will go more up. If you're lower altitude, it won't go so much up, logically enough. But in training, actually, there is not so much different. But that has also to do that as long as we don't acclimatize for a race at altitude, which means then it becomes a power-driven or a velocity-driven block. It means basically the blocks are rather metabolically driven. So you basically say that you set the same cap. The consequence is just that your speed or let's say velocity and power that you're training at has to come down to basically normalize it to the same expenditure that you would have at sea level. So the main difference actually doesn't lie in the training itself, and that costs more at altitude because we cap or we control that metabolically. But it's more that your resting metabolic rate comes up at altitude versus sea level. But that's also why you can see that in pure terms of kilojoule measurements, the largest blocks of kilojoules are not happening at altitude; they are actually happening at sea level as a function of that. So you end up yeah.
Doesn't this mean that your measures would then be underestimated? Because if your BMR goes up, then and then you're looking at multiples of that, it's almost underestimated than using a multiple of an inflated number. Is that fair to say, or not really?
No, not really, because one of the things that double label water, the point with double label water is that it's a reflection of everything you do. So it's not something you only measure during, because what happens that for those people actually maybe we should have started with this. So the way actually double label water works is that you just have a normal bottle of water, but then what you do with that bottle of water, obviously you need to know the content inside. So you use some instruments, but you can just take tap water. Put it simply, you could basically you could just use tap water. But what you need to do is just to analyze, okay, what is in this tap water? So at least you rule out that there is deuterium, or basically 2H and 18O in the bottle there. Those are the isotopes that we use as markers. And the reason why we use hydrogen and oxygen, but with a special isotope, is because when we metabolize, we produce carbon dioxide and we produce water, and they go normally like 1 and 1 more or less. So if you increase your carbon dioxide production by 1.2, you also your water, let's say your water. I wouldn't say water production, but
it functionally is. You're basically changing you're basically changing energy into carbon dioxide and water.
Yeah, we can call it water. We can actually call it water production. So basically, what also you excrete then is then also increased by 1.2. So carbon dioxide goes up by 20%, water production goes up by 20%, and then there are some more nuances to that. But that's what's been validated, or that's the basis of it. So what you normally do is that you take water, as long as you know what's in what's inside that bottle there, you can basically now you're taking basically the deuterium and 18 oxygen, and you basically put a very carefully measured amount of isotopes atoms into the body, now into the water bottle there. So what we use for that is extremely precise scales. So we use a mass spectrometer, but basically you can say you have to use a very, very precise scale, so you know exactly the amount of 2H and 18O that you put inside the bottle there. So this was what it was before. This is what that is inside the bottle. And the reason why we use them is because 2H and 18O is something that normally is not around us. Actually, if you go on a plane and you fly, you can actually have a little bit of exposure to this naturally, because you're traveling from one place to another place in the hemisphere. But that's why we normally say that if you fly into location, you should normally wait 1 week or something like that, ideally 2 weeks, just to be sure that the levels are normalized in your body before you drink the bottle. But basically now we know exactly how much 2H and 18O that are in the bottle. We measure first, what we do before you drink that bottle is that we basically measure your urine so we take a urine sample, we take a duplicate of this, and then we know the base level before you start drinking the bottle. So we know exactly how much 2H and 18O there are in your urine from the samples that we do there. Now you drink the bottle, and the following day, straight up, so you drink this in the evening, and then the morning after we do a new measurement. Obviously now your concentration level will be very high, because you obviously have a lot in your body now. And as you eat and you drink more water and you burn this kind of thing, obviously what happens is that the concentration levels are coming down. Your let's say your body water, this kind of thing, will normally stay fairly stable. Really doesn't matter anyway, or it matters a little bit, but they stay fairly stable. So that what you're looking at is basically the change of concentration of 2H and 18O as a function of, let's say, the other fluids that are coming out there. And now when we measure this over multiple days, you can actually see that if you have a long day, like call it an Ironman day, you will actually start to see that actually what happens there is obviously because you produce more carbon dioxide, or you consume more oxygen, you're producing more carbon dioxide, you're also producing more water. And because of that, you also start to see that there is a larger concentration of 2H and 18O in the urine samples that you take that day. Resting days, you will normally see this is lower, and it follows this more or less from day to day. But that means basically what happens there, and also for those that wonders, basically it tastes the water tastes water. Christian called it tastes a little bit like water that had been standing in the fridge for a couple of weeks. That's what it feels, but there's no taste to it. But again, what happens then is that obviously you produce carbon dioxide all the time, you produce water all the time. That means basically that your resting periods and your resting periods and also your training, everything is basically accounted for in that equation. So you could say that from a purely, if you look at purely work standpoint, yes, then that is underestimated, or it would underestimate that because you get an inflation in the resting values. So we do more work at sea level than what we do up there. So that's correct. But let's say from a metabolic standpoint, then you would say then it's how we control the training. You end up very much with the same equation anyway.
Yeah, and just to clarify that for people talking about the sort of metabolic versus work rate, this is most people would intrinsically understand this, but part of what you are known for is intensity control. That intensity is about metabolic stimulus. That is to say that this is the metabolic stimulus we're providing, which changes based on climate, altitude, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all these factors. The alternate option is to say I'm running X pace or running X power. That is irrelevant of what the cost of that is metabolically, right? So in one, we're controlling metabolism or using metabolism as the controlling point, regardless of the output. In the other one, we're controlling the output and the metabolism will be what it is. Now, in a race, we do the second one, which is we have to just race, and whatever the metabolism is, it is. But when you are at altitude trying to create sustainable training, you tend to control metabolism for that reason. So that's what you were sort of talking about before, where sort of reflective, things being reflective year round. So we did touch on,
and just allude to that, because I think the reason for that is also because one thing that we do know is that if you just go by velocity or you go by power, or let's say you go by speed and you go by power, depending on how you measure or quantify your training sessions, the problem with that is that we know that your energy demand can be different from day to day, even though you do the same, let's say, power output on your power meter. And then the problem with that is that you actually don't know the demands. You don't know actually, because one day, even though you can say that, okay, I'm using probably not that much difference, but you can actually end up using a bit more from your glycolytic system. And that works fine, probably if you're not training too much. But the more you start to train, the better control you need to get over this. And that's why when you do it metabolically driven, rather than you just say, okay, this is what you're looking for, the contribution from the metabolic system. And then basically power has to come down some days to be able to let's say to stay to that intensity control. And other days it can go higher than you actually plan, because there are other things that are promoting more better efficiency and other things like this. So it's I would say one of the keys to why we're able to keep such high volume, so high energy expenditure sustainably over so long time, because you approach it from a let's say from a supply side rather than from a demand side. But like you say, going into a race, at some point it's not enough to just train your metabolic systems and focus on that. And you can also say the metabolic system gets trained always from what you do, but it's just what you decide to control. But obviously they're also coming closer into races, exactly like you said as well. Then it's not necessarily about the metabolic system anymore. Then it's about the demand. This is the demand that you actually have to meet in order to race, and you need to adapt more specifically for that. And that's where our workouts become more than, call it, external metric driven, or basically power driven, velocity driven, and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you're going to plan without the metabolism in mind, you have to give yourself a bigger margin for error because of the variance in that, right? So as somebody who's, say, not using lactate as a controlling measure, then you go, well, I'm going to run whatever pace today. Yeah, that's fine, but you have to give yourself a margin of error because on certain days it's going to cost more than others. So we talked about it already, and this is probably one of the biggest questions that came out of this paper was, now we've got this we got north of 2.5 times, we're at 3.5, 3.6, 3.8 times, BMR, but we also saw then intake was much less than that. So how do we end up with KB's weight staying stable? You mentioned before you get DEXA scans in all these things. So how do we end up with that?
So the reason for that is because the systems for reporting. So this is actually one of the articles that will come I would say that one of the first articles will come in the series now after this one. because obviously one of the things that is important when we also talk about that your precision needs to become higher, obviously precision around intake also is getting also exponentially more important. Like for cyclists, triathletes, and you see there have now been in the last years been a massive shift actually in how you feed also during cycling and so on. But the reason for why we actually decided to publish that, even knowing that basically these numbers doesn't add up, is not because of the numbers, because we know the absolute numbers are wrong. But that has more to do with the method that is used to quantify the food. And we know that these systems are grossly, there is probably not a better word, but grossly off when it comes to estimating the real amount of calories. But the reason for why it is interesting to publish is not because, as long as you say, okay, this is the calorie demand, because that's measured by Doubly labeled water, and then you have the DEXA scans, and you have you have yes, you have the Doubly labeled water, but you have the DEXA scans, you have the weight, and you have the work that they are doing there. Then you know that, okay, when you see that basically body composition, so everything from bone density to fat mass and all these kind of things stays, muscle mass stays the same, and you see that, okay, on the double label water, well, this is basically what is taken from the body as well. Then you know that basically, then you're not taking something away from the body here, and the body is compensating in an unhealthy way to keep a false high weight or something, like you're adding more, you're binding more water to the body, or other things that are starting to get hormonal issues and whatnot. But actually, where you know that the body is in balance. So because you have the DEXA scans, you have the weight, and you have the calorimetry or double labeled water. You know the body is in balance. So now the reason why we publish that is rather to understand the ratios, because what is quite novel here is the crazy amount of carbohydrates that these athletes are eating. So if you take away that and you just scale that number that is there, because obviously we could have just scaled that ourselves, but that's already starting to do something that we shouldn't do with the data, because then we are trying to fit numbers to our story. We're trying to fit numbers to a story, and that's not how you do publishing. You publish the raw data, or the data that basically sits there. And then the users, when they're reading this, they can see, okay, the double labeled water is there, the body weight is there, the DEXA scans have the DEXA scans, and then you basically see these kind of things are in balance. But if the weight and calorie are, so input and output, or let's say weight is maintained, output is quantified, and composition is quantified, then obviously also input have to also be in the same. So you can actually just take the number, scale them, but the ratios are what is really interesting here, because the carbohydrate take that these guys are eating also is quite novel and different from what have been used before. And the thinking behind that as well is that if you think of it in a longer term perspective, and now I'm giving away maybe some gold here, that is that you want to optimize the body to be able to use as little as possible energy to maintain homeostasis, so you can spend more time on training. That's why we don't do calorie restricted rides or anything like this, because it's not about a single session. It's about fueling consistency over time. And when we know that the body basically are able to metabolize carbohydrates much more efficiently than, for example, others, like it's super important for the more important sessions, and to be able to to progress on them. Then basically we also know that you need a certain amount of fat, you need a certain amount of protein, but it's basically the carbohydrates we really need to feed to be able to keep that consistency as well. Otherwise, you'll come into too many sessions with too little, or too glycogen depleted, or not perfectly in homeostasis. And if things is about a progressive overload, you have to feed for that progressive overload to happen. And that means that there are many things that we don't measure, more things we don't measure than we do measure, but at least the things that we do measure, and make sure at least that those don't become the limitation for the following sessions that you want to have the following days, but also the following weeks and the following months, to keep the consistency in the program. So the ratios is really what is interesting here.
Well, I saw some numbers of like 1,000 grams of carbs in a day, which anybody who's done any carb loading knows that's a tough ask on a carb loading day, let alone a normal day. But this speaks to something that I think may be part of the difference, be that genetic, be that training, be that something else, which is, and back to some of the stuff we talked earlier, you've published, you publicized or popularized rather the word, there's no velocity without power, there's no power without calories, right? And so But the calories is the interesting thing, because there's the calories we eat, and for the record, even packets that tell you what the calories are in there is a margin of error in that. So there is the calories we eat, but that's not actually absorbed, right? That is, once you put it in your mouth, it's not absorbed. It has to leave your gut wall into the body, right? And you sort of poop out a certain amount of calories, which is why you've famously burned the boys' poop, so you can see what they aren't absorbing, not what they are, and therefore what they are. But there's what you eat, and then there's what you absorb, and there's what you can use as well, right? And how you use it. All of these different factors, right? Now there's microbiome, there's genetics, all these factors play into perhaps why the guys can absorb perhaps maybe more, right? Therefore sustain it. But you also talked about, and again, you've publicized, or not publicized, but popularized, like using somewhat of, more processed foods than perhaps you would yourself in the boys, because they need the calories, right? Because processing allows absorption, or facilitates absorption. So we kind of end up with this interesting intersection where we know what they're outputting, we know that they're weight stable, therefore we know that they must be intaking very, very high amounts, which you alluded to before. Now the question is, and we can't answer this, is how and why. And some of the reasons are, of course, the amount of carbs they eat, but also they probably absorb them differently for whatever reason, which is absolutely fascinating.
But I think this is also one thing that I actually look forward to doing, and we are we've invested in a calorie bomb to be able also to analyze more, because we're also when you talk about calories, one thing that most people don't actually realize is that the calories that we actually put on packets are more like what you can call bioavailable calories. It's not the real calories that are in there, because there are more calories to foods than what you really are able to extract from it. So that's why you can think of calories in terms of physics. So if you just purely, if you went like full combustion on that food, for example, and how much calories you are able to extract from that in heat, versus, for example, calories that are available to a body. And that is exactly like you say. One part is that basically we know that, let's say, microbiome and other things can adapt to this and get better at it. We know that training phases probably plays a role here. So if you have a very high training volume and where you are you're not able to feed enough, probably more will be extracted from that food, while there are other places where you are more in a surplus and there are less you will extract from the same foods as well. And then you have allergies and other things that comes, intolerances and other things that also makes a difference here. But then also on top of that, a carrot is not a carrot, and a chocolate bar is not a chocolate bar. There are differences between even them, and where you again just ended up saying that our carrot has this many calories, but in fact we don't know. It's so long time ago, many of these studies we have done, that with all the, let's say, changes that, or let's say evolutions, you could almost say, or even worse case, genetic modifications that have been to food. We don't know how much calories there are in a lot of the food that are there. But in the end, the two limitations we really have is, one is oxygen uptake, because we need oxygen to metabolize anything. Talking about anaerobic versus aerobic really has very little value, because anaerobic is just creating a debt that you have to pay back by oxygen afterwards, and it adds to the consistency of anything you do. So the point is that everything needs oxygen. Everything needs oxygen. So that's one limitation we know for us. And the other part is basically how much energy you're able to get from calories. And you want to have the combination where you can get the most calories for the least amount of volume with the least amount of oxygen that goes into the mixture, because that means basically that if you go a little bit more, then you can get more. That's why when you come back to all these discussions around ketones and whatnot that is there, the thing is that if you apply, for example, physics to this, you look at this from a thermodynamic perspective. This is molecules. So if you then basically combust this and so on, and you get the enthalpy, ideally also the entropy, but also so you have the Gibbs free energy for example for something. You basically want to have what allows you consistently over time be able to convert it into valuable energy for the body. So ATPs, for example, for work, but also you obviously need fibers, some of the things that are much less, or virtually we say normally that doesn't carry any calories, but they are food. They are actually food for your microbiome. But that's also when you say that then they eat a lot of processed food. Yes, I'm not a big fan of processed food, to be honest. I actually don't like it, and I start to despise it more and more. But then on the other side, there is a big difference between, for example, where you take glucose, concentrated glucose, and fructose, like the Morton, for example, and you pack it in there, for example, or you use, for example, like the plasmide, for example, then to also to improve the oxygen transport processes for, or let's say, or not necessarily oxygen transport processes. But the point is that for an elite athlete to be the best in the world, you need to eat food that are highly efficient to move you forward. That's a reason for why they're in Formula One is a restriction on what fuel you can only use one fuel for your car, and that is because people understood fairly early on that fuels, well, it's molecules, it's combustion, oxygen coming into the system, and the more energy you can get out of a certain amount of fuel and a certain amount of oxygen, the more powerful it is. And they're basically ketones, fats, proteins, all of these kind of things are inferior compared to carbohydrates. Carbohydrates is king, but you need fats, proteins, you need fibers. And that's why processed food, or call it sports products like Morton, for example, is something you absolutely need in order to perform. But every time outside of sports, this is when they eat whole foods. So they eat and buy whole foods. They make it. We even make it from scratch ourselves. Salads, vegetables, all these kind of things, because we know how important it is, because that will increase the ability for your microbiome and other parts in the body to extract more of the fuel. So when you're eating outside and eating whole foods, you're investing in your body an ability to extract also calories more efficiently from the food as well, and more healthy body, better, everything better.
Yeah. So the last question I wanted to ask, and we don't have a lot of time left, so I'm conscious of that, is around the thresholds. So you obviously published KB's thresholds in there. So you said cycling LT1 was 310 watts. You said LT2 was 373 watts, and in running you said speed was 16.4 watts at LT1, and LT2 was 16.4 kilometers per hour, and LT2 was 19 kilometers per hour. So most people said these were very low, given his ability to run, etc. I guess I've asked you this question off air, so maybe you could share with the users. I guess the short answer to this is you don't use traditional methods in investigating these. You guys use famously long lab sessions to test these, and so can you give us a bit of insight into why these would be artificially lowered, or not artificially lowered, but different to what other people may assume?
Yeah, so what we do know is that when you do testing, it's protocol and method dependent. And one of the things that you will find here is that LT1 more closely resembles fat max, but also fat max is not something that stays constant. If you do a long session, you will also see that where your fat max occur will actually change throughout a long session. And especially also if you start to build intervals, or maybe you do a little bit harder work, there are many ways to manipulate your fat max, for example. That means also that your LT1 will also be manipulated. But LT1, you could say, is more closely related to your fat max. And the reason why we use LT1 and not fat max is because you don't bring a metabolic cart out into the field and do continuous measurement. And yes, the VO2 Master have made this much more practical, but on the other side, you're not going to ride 3 hours, 5 hours, or even hard sessions with the VO2 Master on all the time, because you're not able to drink water very easily and other things. Lactate acts as a good surrogate for this. This is why we not talk about fat mass, but we talk about LT1, because that's practical. That's what we use in the training. So it makes, let's say, communication more precise. And the way we also identify is also if you do 3 minutes, for example, step test, for example, running step test, you will easily overestimate where the LT1 is for an athlete. And the same with LT2 as well. But what we do know is that when the steps gets out to 6 minutes, and so if you have a very long warm up beforehand, so you put a little bit fatigue into the body and this kind of thing, so it starts to be more representative for training session. Then we also do know that, for example, what happens is that basically more of your system, you're getting more energy from oxidative phosphorylation. You're using a little more oxygen, less come from the glycolytic system. And that means also that LT1 value, or let's say even the lactate concentration values, also comes down normally in the body as a function of this. But the point here is that LT1 is what most people would consider their fat max. That would probably and something that Christian, we've had rides that can be 5-6 hours, no problem. I know that there has been a famous athlete saying that he was riding 320 to 340 watts. It was a zone 2 ride, but then he adds 2 very important details afterwards. He says at the end it was not a zone 2 ride, and then more importantly, he says I'm not riding my bike the days after. For Christian, he swims first at around, let's say just below, let's say around threshold, call it sweet spot for many people. And then afterwards he go on a bike and he rides 3, 10, 20, 30 watts for 3, 4, let's say for 4.5 hours. And then he goes off and he runs a marathon at 3, or let's say below 3:30 pace at the fastest. And that going for him and riding in, let's say, call it around fat max, so real fat max, not a zone, but around fat max or LT1 for him for 4-5 hours. That's he can do every day. That is a real. It doesn't drift. The zone doesn't drift. It stays constant. It is also the same from day to day, or he can do it also from day to day without taking any recoveries, large recoveries from this. So the point is, when we talk about zones, the problem with that is that very often people get stuck with all scales, all methods and systems and these kind of things. And it's hard to communicate, because also what we have to remember is that very often when we talk about intensity, we talk of intensity as a y-axis thing. And we have to remember that you can have two persons that have the same critical power, but one can ride his critical power for, let's say, 70 minutes, another one can only ride it for 40 minutes. And that's massive differences in just a single number. And that's also the point here. LT2 session for Christian, we have been pushing these numbers for 90 minutes, for example, in sessions. We could have done longer, but then it would have implications on other things that we didn't want to change. So 80, 90 minutes is something that they do. We do several, I say, we can even do week by week in blocks. So that's again why these numbers looks much lower. So if you rather think of these, let's say, if you look rather at the 375, which actually is not a season high, the season high is actually above 400 watts for LT2 for him. But we are talking here about something that he can ride 80 to 90 minutes continuously. And the LT1 is basically what he can do for 4 or 5 hours. And he can go out doing it basically every day for him as well. So that gives maybe a little bit more context to the way we identify it, because we call it LT1 and LT2 also, is because we look at lactate, and to make it practical, we have long enough steps so the body is able to find homeostasis as long as it can, but then above it becomes more clear when it's not. And that means also that LT2 to a large extent also resembles maximum lactate steady state for the body as well. VT2 will normally sits actually a bit, or not a little bit, actually quite a bit higher for this for Christian. His maximum lactate steady state also coming in a paper in the future, but it sits significantly lower than one for him, much lower than actually has been also reported in papers before. But again, another part of the article series coming in the future.
Yeah, and that, I guess that speaks to capacity, or what some people would call fatigue resistance or durability. You're bringing that in as a factor because it's a relevant factor for them in their competitions. So
I'm getting this strange light.
Yeah, it's okay. It's very eerie, but I think those who are watching on YouTube or on Spotify will appreciate it. The limitations of computer cameras. But Olav, you've got a heart out. Really appreciate your time. Really appreciate your insights. Looking forward to the rest of the papers. You can put me down as one of the people you email an early manuscript to if you want. Happy to have a read and give thoughts. But we do really appreciate you. Thank you again to the listeners for joining us today on the Norwegian Method podcast. Do share this with somebody who you think would be interested in it, particularly those who were commenting on social media. I think they'd gain something out of this and enjoy it. Subscribe to the podcast feed if you are yet to do so, or indeed on YouTube, or both. And if you haven't yet rated the podcast, we would appreciate that as well. So thank you very much to everybody, and thank you, Olav.
Thank you, David.
The Norwegian Method.